In the summer of 1944, German generals watched the Allied advance from behind their shattered lines in France and laughed. They had seen the endless columns of American trucks clogging the Norman roads and thought the enemy had built a machine too heavy to move. "The Americans cannot fight without their gasoline and canned food," one officer joked. To the German staff, the U.S. Army looked like a creature that would starve the moment its supply line stretched too far. They had reason to believe it. Every German campaign, from Poland to France and the Soviet Union, had been built on speed, on light formations that lived off captured depots. The Americans, by contrast, hauled everything: tents, mail, spare parts, even ice cream mix. German officers mocked the material warriors, certain their appetite for fuel and comfort would destroy them faster than any battle. But beneath that arrogance, a quiet danger was building. After the breakout from Normandy, General George S. Patton's Third Army advanced faster than any army in modern history. In just days, his tanks raced across northern France, so fast that supply lines couldn't keep up. Fuel trucks bogged down behind destroyed bridges, trains were jammed, and depots still stood on the beaches. Patton's spearheads were about to halt, not from enemy fire, but from empty gas tanks. On August 25, 1944, while Paris celebrated liberation, Patton's men counted the gallons left in their vehicles. Some crews siphoned fuel from wrecks, others mixed aviation gasoline with diesel to keep moving. The generals who had laughed were about to see a miracle of organization that no one had planned and no manual had foreseen. Within days, an improvised highway system would appear, hundreds of miles of road marked only by red balls on signs and truck hoods. Along it, thousands of drivers would race day and night, moving more fuel and ammunition than any army in history had ever attempted. They called it the Red Ball Express. It would turn ridicule into respect and show the world that America's real weapon was not the tank or the bomber, but the ability to move them anywhere, anytime. By mid-August 1944, General George S. Patton's Third Army had become a blur on German maps. From Normandy's hedgerows to the open plains beyond the Seine, his armored columns moved faster than any staff officer could chart. Patton's mantra was simple: attack and keep attacking. Yet even an army built on momentum cannot run without fuel. Each tank in his spearhead burned nearly 4 gallons for every mile. Every advance demanded truck convoys loaded with gasoline, food, spare parts, and ammunition. But the ports of France were still in ruins. Most supplies still landed on the beaches at Normandy, 400 miles away. Rail lines were wrecked, bridges destroyed, and fuel depots dangerously far behind. In the first days of September, Patton's men had driven farther than any Allied plan expected. His troops were already near the German border, and suddenly the pumps ran dry. Entire divisions stood still on French roads, engines silent, crews waiting. Some tankers joked that they had traded their guns for gas cans. Patton didn't laugh. The Allies possessed overwhelming strength, but their logistics chain was stretched to the breaking point. Eisenhower's headquarters tried to divide limited supplies among multiple armies. Montgomery wanted priority for his northern thrust, while Patton demanded enough fuel to keep driving east. The great Allied machine that had stormed the beaches was now trapped by its own success. Every day, thousands of gallons sat idle on the Normandy beaches because trucks couldn't reach the front. Mechanics worked by lantern light, converting captured German fuel drums into temporary tanks. Engineers patched roads for convoys that never arrived. Patton's frustration grew, not with the enemy, but with distance itself. In private, he warned his staff, "If we stop now, they'll have time to breathe." He was right. German resistance was stiffening along the Moselle, and every lost hour gave them time to regroup. The answer would not come from strategy, but from logistics, from a desperate idea that turned into one of the boldest operations of the war. In late August, Allied planners conceived a rolling highway of supply trucks running 24 hours a day from the beaches to the front. No stops, no detours, no delays. A continuous lifeline to keep Patton's engines alive. Its codename, Red Ball Express. In the final days of August 1944, Allied supply officers faced a simple, terrifying fact. The armies in France were moving faster than the supply system could feed them. Every advance deepened the gap between Patton's spearheads and the fuel dumps on the Normandy beaches. Eisenhower demanded a solution that could move thousands of tons every day, immediately. The answer came from the oldest rule in war: if the railways are broken, build a road. Within days, planners from the Transportation Corps drew a red circle on a map between the beaches and the forward depots. It would be a one-way highway, running non-stop convoys eastbound to the front and returning empty westbound. Signs and truck markings would carry a single symbol: a red ball, the railway signal that meant priority movement, clear the track. On August 25, 1944, the first trucks rolled out. 2 parallel routes, stretching more than 700 miles combined, linked the ports of Normandy to the advancing Third Army. More than 6,000 vehicles would join within weeks. GMC deuce-and-a-half trucks, tankers, and wreckers forming an unbroken chain of motion. Drivers ran day and night. Headlights were blacked out. Dust clouds hung over the roads. Convoys moved at 15 miles an hour, spaced exactly 60 yards apart, horns blaring as they passed through shattered French towns. Mechanics and military police patrolled every few miles to keep the flow alive. The system worked because discipline replaced infrastructure. Fuel, food, and ammunition reached the front faster than any rail line could have delivered. In its first week, the Red Ball Express carried 12,000 tons. By September, that doubled. Every gallon of gasoline meant another mile for Patton's armor. Eisenhower called it a miracle of improvisation. To the men who drove it, it was simply endless motion, an army of trucks that never slept, bound together by urgency and dust. What began as a temporary fix would soon become the artery of liberation. The Red Ball Express had been born out of desperation, but it would grow into the greatest motor convoy operation in history, proof that America's industrial muscle could bend even time and distance to its will. Behind the roar of engines and the dust of the Red Ball Express were men whose names rarely reached the headlines. More than 75% of the drivers were African American soldiers from service units, mechanics, cooks, and laborers who suddenly became the backbone of Patton's Blitz. Segregation still ruled the U.S. Army, but on those French roads, color mattered less than courage. They drove overloaded trucks through rain, darkness, and enemy air patrols, keeping an army alive on wheels. For most, it was their first time in Europe. Many had trained as drivers in supply battalions that were considered non-combat roles. Yet the reality of the Red Ball Express turned them into frontline soldiers of a different kind. They faced ambushes, mines, and accidents at every turn. The convoys were so constant that locals said the rumble of engines never stopped. Each truck carried up to 5 tons. Fuel drums, shells, food, or spare parts, often stacked so high that drivers could barely see the road ahead. They ran 20-hour shifts, sleeping on steering wheels when exhaustion set in. When rain turned roads to mud, they chained the wheels. When bridges collapsed, they built their own detours. Maintenance crews followed in jeeps, patching engines with scrap and salvaged parts. Despite the fatigue, there was pride. They called themselves the Lifeline and knew it was true. One driver later recalled, "If we stopped, Patton stopped." It wasn't empty talk. Each gallon of gasoline they delivered kept tanks moving, planes fueled, and wounded evacuated. The Red Bull Express became a rare moment in that segregated army when performance outshone prejudice. Officers began to notice the discipline, precision, and sheer endurance of their drivers. The men behind the wheel earned respect not through speeches, but through motion, mile after mile, road after road, until exhaustion and victory blurred together. By the end of the first month, they had moved more than 100,000 tons of supplies. The roads were cracked, the trucks battered, but the line never broke. Each soldier learned a truth the Germans had never understood. The American war machine was not built on perfection. It was built on persistence. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply route. It was a battlefield made of dirt and exhaustion. The roads themselves became enemies. Rain turned them into rivers of mud. Heat baked them into choking dust. Engines overheated, tires burst, and men fought sleep at the wheel while driving convoys that never stopped moving. The trucks were heavy, overloaded, and often repaired more by ingenuity than by tools. Every mile was a test of endurance. Drivers followed strict spacing to prevent collisions, but fog and darkness erased those rules. When brakes failed on downhill curves, the only option was to jump clear. When a truck stalled, it had to be pushed aside immediately. The convoy could not stop. If one vehicle blocked the route, hundreds behind it would be trapped. Enemy aircraft still prowled the skies. Though the Luftwaffe was fading, occasional strafing runs tore through the lines without warning. Men dove into ditches, then climbed back into their trucks to keep the flow alive. Roadside graves marked the cost of that persistence. Despite the chaos, the system worked with astonishing precision. Convoys moved on schedule, guided by military police who directed traffic at every junction. Field kitchens set up along the route so drivers could grab food without leaving their seats. Repair crews salvaged wrecks under lantern light, pulling engines apart beside the road while others rolled past them. To mark their vehicles, drivers painted red circles on doors and hoods, a badge of pride. Locals learned to step aside when they saw that emblem. It meant speed and purpose. French villagers often waved or offered water as the convoys roared through their towns at all hours. Every gallon of gasoline hauled forward burned in the next day's advance. Every broken axle or lost truck slowed that rhythm. Yet through fatigue, weather, and danger, the red ball kept moving. Not because it was easy, but because stopping meant defeat. The men behind the wheel didn't carry rifles, but they fought a war of endurance. Their weapon was movement. Their victory was measured not in battles won, but in miles completed. By early September 1944, Patton's Third Army was consuming fuel faster than any army in history. His tanks guzzled nearly 400,000 gallons a day. Every shell fired, every jeep that moved, every hot meal at the front. All of it depended on the Red Ball Express. At its peak, the operation ran nearly 6,000 trucks, hauling 12,000 tons of supplies every day from Normandy to the front lines. Each truck carried drums of gasoline, crates of ammunition, and rations stacked to the roof. The road was never empty. Even at night, convoys of headlights snaked through the French countryside like rivers of fire. The route began at St. Lo, near the beaches where the Allies had landed 3 months earlier, and stretched more than 400 miles east toward the advancing spearheads. Drivers slept in their seats, ate cold rations, and measured life in miles instead of hours. They drove through rain, blackout, and exhaustion, because Patton's tanks could not wait. On some days, the Red Ball Express delivered more fuel than all Allied railways in France combined. It became a rolling miracle of logistics, a system built not on planning, but on willpower. Mechanics worked 24 hours a day to keep trucks alive. One broken axle could mean a halted division. At the front, tank crews watched for the dust clouds that meant the next convoy was near. Gasoline arrived just as fuel gauges hit empty. Ammunition trucks pulled in as artillery batteries ran out of shells. It was timing that bordered on impossible, but it worked. German intelligence officers were stunned. They had assumed Patton's advance would stall for lack of fuel. Instead, his tanks kept coming. Faster, louder, unstoppable. Captured reports later revealed a single phrase scrawled across one German map. Americans have learned movement. The Red Bull Express had transformed the U.S. Army into a force that could outrun its own expectations. Every drum that reached the front meant another town liberated, another bridge crossed, another mile closer to Germany. It was not glory that kept the trucks rolling. It was necessity. And in that necessity, the Allies discovered their greatest strength, the ability to move farther and faster than anyone thought possible. In the autumn of 1944, German generals began to grasp what had happened. The armies they once mocked were moving with a rhythm no one could stop. Patton's divisions seemed to appear everywhere at once, striking, flanking, surrounding. For the first time in the war, German intelligence officers admitted they could not keep up, not because of superior weapons, but because of supply. Reports reached Berlin, describing an endless stream of American trucks. Prisoners spoke of a highway that never slept, of convoys marked by red circles rushing forward day and night. One captured officer called it a second invasion of gasoline. German logistics were collapsing. Fuel trains sat idle. Airfields had no aviation gas, and entire panzer battalions stood abandoned for lack of diesel. The Americans, by contrast, burned more fuel in a day than the Germans produced in a week, and still had enough to feed and move millions of men. The Wehrmacht had always believed war was won by tactics. by the cleverness of generals and the bravery of soldiers. But the Red Ball Express revealed a new truth. Wars in the modern age were won by industry, organization, and motion. In September, a captured German general was shown a photograph of an American convoy stretching beyond the horizon. He reportedly laughed, then sighed, saying, "Now I understand. We never had a chance." For the Allies, the Red Ball Express was improvisation turned into doctrine, logistics as a weapon. It proved that victory belonged not just to those who fought, but to those who could keep fighting without pause. By the time Patton's tanks reached the Moselle River, the front lines had outrun the maps. Fuel still arrived. Ammunition still came. And the Germans realized too late that they were no longer fighting an army. They were fighting a supply chain that never stopped breathing. The laughter that had begun months earlier had turned to silence. The men who once mocked America's excess now understood its purpose. Abundance, when organized, was power. The Red Ball Express was more than a road. It was a living machine. Every hour, every mile, every driver was a gear turning inside something far larger than any one soldier could see. It had no pause, no silence, no night. When the sun set, the convoy lights flickered on, covered with blackout hoods that gave the impression of fireflies moving through the dark. Crews rotated in endless shifts. When one man's hands cramped on the wheel, another slid in to take his place. Engines never cooled. Trucks that broke down were stripped for parts, their carcasses pushed into ditches so the next convoy wouldn't stop. Mechanics lived beside the road, sleeping on piles of tires, covered in dust and oil. Field kitchens cooked on stoves set up in truck beds. Drivers ate while driving. Cold coffee, canned meat, biscuits passed from one vehicle to another at brief halts. Showers were rare, sleep rarer. The road belonged to them, and for weeks they became part of it. The schedule was brutal but precise. Convoys left at timed intervals, spaced by minutes, monitored by military police with stopwatches. Each had a specific load, route, and destination code. If a truck didn't arrive, someone knew within the hour. Discipline was absolute. The nickname, "the machine that never slept," wasn't poetic. It was truth. Fuel depots at the front lit up the night with the glow of gasoline fires as drums were emptied and returned west. Every empty can was refilled and sent back within hours. Even when storms flooded the roads or enemy planes strafed the route, the trucks kept coming. One officer wrote in his log, "It is not war as I knew it. It is something industrial, mechanical, a tide of engines unstoppable." To the Germans, it seemed impossible that humans could sustain such rhythm. But for the Americans, it became second nature, a test of endurance that transformed chaos into order. Every driver knew the rule. The moment you stop, someone else pays for it at the front. And so, the Red Ball kept breathing, a steel lung feeding Patton's advance. One drum, 1 mile, one heartbeat at a time. By late September 1944, the Red Ball Express had reached its limit. The trucks were tired, the men exhausted, and the roads breaking apart under the constant weight of movement. Each GMC Deuce and a half was built to last, but few were meant to run 20 hours a day without rest. Engines overheated, suspensions cracked, and tires shredded on roads that were never meant for this kind of traffic. At maintenance depots, mechanics worked like surgeons. They stripped engines, welded frames, and patched fuel tanks with tin and rags. When spare parts ran out, they scavenged from wrecks. Every night the ditches filled with broken vehicles, each one a reminder of how fragile the lifeline really was. For the drivers, exhaustion became the enemy. Some fell asleep behind the wheel and never woke again. Convoy commanders ordered loud music, open windows, and constant talking to keep their men conscious. Military police sometimes pulled sleeping drivers out of their seats and forced replacements in just to keep the line moving. No one complained. They all knew the rule. The front couldn't wait. Rain made everything worse. Bridges collapsed under the weight of trucks. Mud swallowed tires to the axle. Convoys detoured through fields and forests, carving new roads just to reach the depots. Yet even then, the trucks kept rolling. If one route closed, another opened. If one engine died, another took its load. By the start of October, the Red Ball Express had carried over 400,000 tons of supplies across France. It was an achievement built not on comfort or rest, but on willpower. The men joked that the trucks were held together by faith and wire. But beneath the humor was pride. They knew what they were accomplishing was unprecedented, and that every mile brought the war closer to Germany's heart. The strain showed in every face, every vehicle, every breath of smoke rising from a convoy that refused to stop. What had begun as an emergency measure had become the very rhythm of Allied victory. By early October 1944, the Red Ball Express had turned from an emergency measure into a lifeline that defined Allied momentum. What began as a desperate gamble on the beaches of Normandy now stretched across the breadth of France, an artery of motion that refused to slow. Patton's Third Army stood on the threshold of Germany, its tanks idling just miles from the border, engines rumbling like a warning. But each advance demanded more than courage. Every new town captured added another 50 miles of supply line to protect. Fuel trucks had to travel deeper into enemy territory, through broken bridges and mined roads, to reach the front. The longer the route grew, the more fragile it became. Still, the flow did not stop. In some sectors, convoys rolled within earshot of German artillery. Shells burst in the distance as drivers pressed forward. Headlights dimmed, tires pounding the same rutted tracks day after day. The French countryside bore the scars. Grooves from tires, wrecked vehicles pushed into ditches, signs marked only with red circles pointing east. By this stage, each day's output measured in miracles. 6,000 trucks, 300,000 gallons of fuel, and tens of thousands of shells delivered with precision few peacetime systems could match. It was a logistical orchestra, played by men who had learned to think in rhythm, not rest. In November, as the rains came and the Allied line stretched even farther, Patton's army prepared for its next great challenge, crossing the German frontier. The Red Ball Express would carry them there. Fuel depots were leapfrogged forward, bridging units built roads overnight, and engineers marked every usable crossing on the Moselle. When Patton's tanks finally crossed into Germany, it was not a sudden charge, but a steady roll, the natural extension of a system that had been perfecting motion for months. Behind every mile of advance stood 1,000 invisible hands. Drivers, loaders, mechanics, and dispatchers. The German officers who had once laughed now stared in disbelief as reports poured in. The Americans have found a way to move war itself. The Red Ball Express had carried them across France, over the rivers, and now to the gates of Germany. It had transformed logistics from a problem into a weapon, one that could break armies without firing a shot. By November 1944, the roar of engines that had once echoed across France began to fade. The Red Ball Express, the unstoppable highway of motion, was finally slowing down. The same speed that had made it a miracle had also made it unsustainable. The roads were torn apart, trucks worn down to metal skeletons, and men who had driven for months could barely stay awake. The front had moved so far east that the old routes no longer made sense. New supply lines opened through the rebuilt ports of Cherbourg and Antwerp, and repaired railways began carrying the heavy loads more efficiently than trucks ever could. After nearly 3 months of non-stop operation, the Red Ball Express had done its job. It had carried the war from the beaches to the border. But shutting it down was bittersweet. For the drivers, it had become more than an assignment. It was a brotherhood, a rhythm, a challenge that had defined their place in a war that often overlooked them. They had faced danger without medals, endured without rest, and built something history would only begin to understand years later. By the time the last convoys rolled west in mid-November, the numbers were staggering. More than 412,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, and supplies had been delivered. Over 23,000 trucks had taken part, driven by more than 6,000 men, most of them African American. They had turned chaos into coordination, and desperation into victory. The end of the Red Ball Express didn't come with fanfare or speeches. The trucks were parked, engines cooled, and signs with red circles quietly taken down. The men washed the dust from their uniforms and prepared for the next campaign, the final push into Germany. Yet in the silence that followed, commanders understood what they had witnessed. Without those convoys, Patton's advance would have stopped in the fields of France. Without those drivers, the liberation of Europe would have taken months longer. The Red Ball Express had proven something the world would not forget. That speed and courage were meaningless without the men who kept the wheels turning. When historians look back at the Allied victory in Europe, they often speak of generals and battles, of tanks and air raids. But behind every success was a road built by ordinary men who refused to stop. The Red Ball Express did more than move supplies. It redefined how modern war was fought. In just 82 days, it carried more than 500,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, and rations across a shattered continent. It turned an army stalled by distance into a force that could outrun its enemy. The Germans called it madness. Patton called it genius, and for the soldiers who lived it, it was both. A blur of engines, danger, and exhaustion that changed the course of the war. The Red Ball Express proved that logistics is not the background of battle. It is the battle. Without it, tanks are statues, and strategy is only ink on paper. With it, the impossible becomes routine. That truth would shape every war that followed, from Korea to the Gulf, where supply lines became as decisive as weapons. For the African-American drivers who made up most of the convoys, the legacy ran deeper. They returned home from Europe, knowing they had carried victory on their shoulders, even if few would ever say their names. Their discipline, courage, and skill forced the U.S. Army to re-examine its own prejudices. In the years after the war, many of those same men would form the backbone of the newly integrated American military. Decades later, some veterans returned to France and stood on the quiet roads they once thundered across. The fields were green again, the towns rebuilt, and the red circle signs long gone. But if you listened closely, they said, you could still hear the hum of engines in the distance, a ghost of movement that had once saved an army. The Red Ball Express wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't meant to be remembered. Yet, its legacy lives in every modern supply convoy, every logistics network that keeps armies and nations alive. It was proof that victory does not always belong to those at the front of the line. Sometimes, it belongs to those who kept the line moving.